Hey everyone, this is Mike and welcome back to Raiding 101. Today we're going to be talking about mitigation. Now when I say mitigation, I don't mean what kind of cooldowns should tanks use in order to survive tank busters, but I'm talking about mitigation in general when it comes down to mitigating all types of damages that is going to be happening on your party. So this could be auto attacks on the tanks, tank busters, and raid-wide AoEs as well, because every single job in the game has something that they can contribute on pretty much any fight in the game. There are some very minor exceptions where the boss only does one type of damage, but those are very few and far in between. So today is just going to be a generalized guide, so to speak, on what types of damages are in the game and how you can mitigate all of those. I also made little like charts, so to speak, throughout the video. I'll show them towards the end again as well, when we do a quick little TLDR to see what works on what type of damage, because knowing how to mitigate stuff can be very important, not only when it comes down to helping your healers out, because of course if you mitigate damage, that means your healers will have to heal less, meaning that they can do more damage, but also so that they won't be as stressed having to heal up and stuff like that. A very good example of that would be the final phase of Titan, for example, from the last raid tier. There's a lot of outgoing damage there, both from Mini Titan as well as from Big Titan. So if you're not mitigating any damage there, your healers are quite literally just going to be spamming heals, and then they'll still have trouble keeping the party alive. Whereas if you use your mitigation correctly, you use your addles, you use your feints, you use your percentage-based mitigation, your raid-wide mitigation, all of that kind of stuff, then you're going to give your healers a much easier time healing the party up during that part, and it won't be as stressful for them, it won't be as stressful for their mana, because of course the more they have to be healing, the more stressed their mana is going to be, and it might also mean that they can put in some extra DPS and that kind of stuff, which again, as I said yesterday, the more damage you can squeeze out when it comes down to those first clears, the easier it's going to be for you to clear that DPS check and get that first clear as well. So with all of that out of the way, let's talk about the 4 different damage types that are in the game and how that we can mitigate all of them. We're going to start with the 2 most prominent ones, being physical and magical, and then we'll move onwards to gravity and darkness damage as well towards the end of the video. So, physical damage. This is usually your auto attacks. Certain fights also have magical auto attacks, but those don't really happen all that often. Usually auto attacks are physical damage. It can also come in the form of a tank buster. Usually you'll see something like, for example, slashing damage, piercing damage, or blunt damage. I believe Shiva has a physical auto attack as well. I'm not 100% sure of that because I haven't tanked and I'm not really paying attention to that stuff. But usually whenever it leaves something like, for example, blunt resistance down, slashing resistance down, piercing resistance down on the main tank, when they take a tank buster, then you know, oh, that's physical damage, meaning that you can't use stuff like Dark Mind for it, or other magical preventing like cooldowns and that kind of stuff. So physical damage can be mitigated by using percentage-based mitigation. This means stuff like Rampart, Reprisal, shields, because of course shields always will work. But also stuff like Feint works on physical damage. Feint only works on physical damage, by the way. Some people are kind of sleeping on Feint as being useful at some points, but being able to throw a Feint on the boss to either mitigate a tank buster that is physical based can be very useful, but certain auto attacks can also be very nice to be mitigated as well. For example, when you're in a scenario where the boss is doing a lot of raid-wide AoE damage and your tank is still taking auto attacks in the process, it might be very useful to mitigate some of those auto attacks as well. And then last but not least, we also have parry. Now, parry is not necessarily a big factor in Shadowbringers. It was much more of a factor back in Stormblood, but Gunbreaker still has camouflage, which boosts your parry rate by 50%. Now, when we're talking about using a parry cooldown for a tank buster, I wouldn't rely on it, because of course it only has a chance to proc. I believe Gunbreakers boosts your parry rate by like 50% or something like that, so it is nice to still use, and then if you get the parry proc, okay, even better, because you're mitigating more damage, but I would never rely on parry at the moment in the current patch of Shadowbringers to actually survive through a tank buster or something like that. So using camouflage can still be very useful for example, mitigating stuff like auto attacks, in dungeons especially. is really good because you have a lot of mobs attacking you at the same time, usually with physical attacks. So that's where parry really shines. But when it comes down to like a boss fight and you mitigating one instance of a tank buster, for example, I wouldn't rely on parry saving your life. But parry still mitigates physical auto attacks when it does occur. So when, for example, we go into the next expansion or something like that, or they change some like tank cooldowns where parrying actually gets to 100% or something like that, then parry could be very useful for physical attacks as well. Then moving on to magical, we can use most of the stuff that we just used for the physical attacks as well. It's just that we're going to be using some different stuff as well. So first of all, we have, of course, when we're talking about magic damage, usually this is going to be your tank busters and your raid-wide AoEs. In certain cases, this can also be auto attacks, but again, that doesn't happen all that often. So we can still use all of our percentage-based mitigation. When I'm talking percentage-based, it's not only just like tank cooldowns like Reprisal or Rampart and that kind of stuff, but you also have your Troubadour, Tactician and Shield Samba from your ranged physical DPS, and stuff like the White Mage Wings, Sacred Soil I believe it's called, that kind of stuff from your healers also works on this stuff. Then, of course, from the magical, the ranged magical DPS, the casters, we have Addle. This only works when there is an actual target to Addle as well, by the way. So, for example, if we're going back to that Titan example, when the big Titan in the final phase, you can't physically target the big Titan, meaning that when he does his attacks, you need stuff that puts a defensive buff on your party. So stuff like Tactician, Troubadour, Sacred Soil, White Mage Wings, those are pieces of mitigation that will give your team a defensive buff, whereas something like an Addle is a debuff that you put on the boss. So if you want to use Addle, you need to make sure that you can actually target the boss that is doing the damage, rather than, for example, if it's something in the background that is doing it or something like that. Then, of course, we also have our magical mitigation. This is stuff like Heart of Light, Dark Missionary, Dark Mind, that kind of stuff will work only on magical damage. So, for example, if there is a physical tank buster, you can't use Dark Mind on that. And then on the other two types of damages that we're going to be seeing, Darkness and Gravity, this doesn't work on that either. So very important that you know what is actual magical damage. And then last but not least, of course, we have our shields again. Shields are very universal, meaning that they work on all types of damage. So shields are really strong. So something like a warrior in certain fights where there is a lot of gravity damage, for example, can be extremely good because only shields work on that type of damage. So depending on the fight, certain tanks might be preferred. And also in certain fights, your Scholar or your Shield Astrologian might have to use their shields a little bit more because you can't use stuff like Addle. Reprisal works on almost everything. But for example, like your Addle, your Feint, or some other stuff like that. Then moving on to darkness damage first. Darkness is essentially kind of the same as physical and magical damage in the sense that it just does a certain amount of damage. But you can't use your specific types of mitigation for it. Like, for example, Feint is specific for physical damage. Addle is specific for magical damage. Darkness is unexpected damage, I'll just call it like that, meaning that you can't use those kind of things. So you can only rely on your percentage-based mitigation. Again, Reprisal, Tactician, White Mage Wings, that kind of stuff, and your shields. Shields, again, universal, can be used on everything. Meaning that darkness damage is a little bit hard to mitigate, but on the other hand, there is so much percentage-based mitigation in the game at the moment that it's really not that big of an issue. The last damage type, gravity damage, is the one that is dangerous though, because of two reasons. First reason is that it can only be mitigated through shields. So you can't use Reprisal, you can't use tank cooldowns for this. The only thing that will work are shields. So that's the first important thing. Now, the second thing, and this is what makes gravity damage so dangerous, is because it is percentage-based damage on your characters. So, depending on your maximum HP, gravity damage is going to do different damage values to you. So, for example, a tank is going to be taking more damage from this than, say, a DPS or a healer. And that is the main thing that will kill people, because when a raid-wide AoE is happening and you look at your tank, for example, the main tank is taking auto attacks or something like that, you usually don't go like, oh shit, I need to save that tank because he's at 75% HP, because when a raid-wide AoE happens, usually your DPS and your healers drop really low, but your tanks only drop to like half HP or something like that, because they have bonus armor, they have bonus HP and that kind of stuff. They might even have a defensive cooldown running at that point, so they don't usually take as much damage from your raid-wide AoEs and that kind of stuff. But when it comes down to gravity damage, your tanks will actually be taking more damage because they have more maximum HP. So when, for example, the party gets hit for, let's say, 50,000 damage by this gravity damage, your tanks are going to get hit for 75,000 or something like that. Of course, this is not exact math, but it's just there to paint a picture. So when it comes down to gravity damage, it's very easy to identify, because all of a sudden everyone is going to drop to, let's say, 25% HP. So that's how you can kind of identify that it is indeed gravity damage. And then you also know that you will need shields for this, because stuff like Reprisal, Addle, Feint and all of that kind of stuff is not going to be working on this. And your tanks also can't do anything themselves to mitigate it, because, as I said, percentage-based mitigation doesn't work on it. So you can't just like pop a Reprisal, pop a Rampart, a Sentinel or anything like that in order to mitigate this type of damage. So you gotta really babysit your tanks for the most part, because it's very unexpected for your tank to drop super low from a raid-wide damaging attack. So those are the 4 different types of damages in the game. Those are how you mitigate them. We have physical damage, which is mitigated through percentage-based mitigation, shields, feint and parry if you get lucky. We have magical damage that is mitigated by, again, percentage-based shields, Addle, and then magical defense, like for example that Heart of Light, Dark Missionary, etc. Then we have darkness damage that is only mitigated by percentage-based mitigation and shields. And then we have gravity damage that is only mitigated by shields, and gravity damage itself also does percentage-based damage depending on your maximum HP. One final thing that I forgot to mention when it comes down to physical damage is there are technically different kinds of physical damage as well. So for example, if we look at a fight like UCOB, I know this is an old fight, but it's a good example. When we look at Twintania and Nail, the first 2 bosses, they both have physical tank busters, but Twintania will do slashing damage and Nail will do piercing damage. Now, it's actually not important to know that they do that when it comes down to mitigating the attacks, because they're both physical damage. So stuff like parrying and feint will work on all of these different types of physical attacks, being piercing, slashing, blunt. There's probably some others out there as well, but basically they're all physical based attacks, meaning that feint and parry and stuff like that will work on those different physical types as well. So you don't really need to pay too much attention to that. It's only important, like for example, if you have the slashing debuff, that you're not tanking Twintania or something like that. But that's a little bit more fight specific, something like that. So when it comes down to physical damage, don't worry too much about what type of physical damage it is. You're all going to be handling it in the same way, and you're going to be able to use those same cooldowns, even if it is like a different debuff that you get, for example, if it's a tank swap, tank buster or something like that. But those are the 4 different types of damage that exist in the game. That's how you handle them. Hope it was helpful. Hope you learned something new. I want to thank you for watching. I want to thank my Patreons for supporting me, and I'll see you in the next one.